Good afternoon. First off, I want to thank the members of the State Assembly, all the members, Republican and Democrat alike. Having served in that body, I know what a lengthy debate is about, although I don't think I ever had a debate as long on a bill as they've had over the last couple of days. Hopefully all of them have got a chance to catch a little sleep since then, but I want to make it abundantly clear that I thank all of them, not only those who supported my bill, the budget repair bill, but also those who were in opposition to it, because they're doing what we're hoping Senate Democrats will do. They're actually showing up and having a vote. Because ultimately, when I served in the legislature, that was the most important part of my job, was the vote on behalf of the constituents I served in my district. And that's the expectation I think all of us have of all the members, Republican or Democrat alike, from any part of the state of Wisconsin. Today was a particularly good day for me because I get to get out of the Capitol. I spent some time traveling the state. I started out this morning in Kenosha. I went up to Green Bay. I just came back from Rhinelander. And the reason I went to those places, got a great response, even coming in and out from folks, talked to, in fact, it was interesting. Actually, I had a guy in Kenosha tell me he was a union guy, but he supported what we're doing. Up in Rhinelander, I had a government worker, a county worker, who told me, even though he worked for the government, he thought we were doing the right thing to get this budget intact. But the most important reason I was there was to ask in Kenosha for Senator Wirtz, in Green Bay for Senator Hansen, and in Rhinelander for Senator Hoprin, for them to come back and do their job. And ultimately to make an appeal to the constituents in their districts and the districts of all the others who are missing in action, to come back and do the job they were elected to do. I think it's plain and simple. Overwhelmingly, people across the state, no matter what their opinion, for, against, or somewhere in between on the budget repair bill, I think overwhelmingly the sentiment out there is the place that you have that debate is right here in the Capitol. So again, I'm pleading with people all across this state to call their state senators and ask them to come back to the Capitol and vote on this bill. Now, for them, I think there's a path to come back. You see, 2 weeks ago, just back here in my office, I sat down with Senator Mark Miller, and I sat down with Representative Peter Barca, and before I introduced our budget repair bill to the public, I walked them through what was in that bill. In fact, I gave them a detailed memo that we put out later publicly, but I gave it to them in advance that walked them through piece by piece what was in this bill. And as you can imagine, they weren't necessarily supportive of all the pieces in there. That's understandable. I'm not asking for everybody to be in universal agreement with them, but I am asking for people to have the debate, to have the discussion, and ultimately to have the vote here in the Capitol. Now, days after I gave that advance notice to the Democrat leaders in the Assembly and the Senate, 14 state Senate Democrats walked out of this state, walked out of this Capitol, I should say, and then walked out of the state. And at the time, if you recall, the reason they said they were doing it was because they thought the pace was moving too quickly, that the public didn't have an opportunity to see what was in this bill, to understand what was in this bill. Well, let's go over what's happened in the last 2 weeks. We had a week and a half ago, the Joint Finance Committee had a public hearing on this, 17 and a half hours. In all my time in the legislature, I can't recall a time that came close to 17 and a half hours of testimony. Over the last several days, we had day after day after day of debate on the budget repair bill in the State Assembly. More debate than I can ever recall on a single piece of legislation. If the goal of the state Senate was to ensure that people all across this state understood what was in this bill, I think they've succeeded. I think there's not a person out there, at least anybody who's been paying attention to all of you in the news, who doesn't understand what's happening here in the state Capitol and what's inside this bill. Now again, people from across the spectrum, from across the state, have different opinions, and I respect that, and I appreciate the fact that those who feel passionately have been civil and have been straightforward about their beliefs both for and against this bill. But I don't think anyone can say that the Senate Democrats haven't succeeded in giving us the time for everyone in this state to understand what's in this bill. To me, that's a clear signal that now is the time to come forward. Now is the time to come back. If what they said was they wanted more time to understand what's in the bill, they have it. The details are out there, the facts are on the table, and the facts are clear. We need to make a commitment to the future. Because if we don't, if those Senate Democrats don't come back to vote, we pass on not only dire consequences today, we pass on those dire consequences by failing to make a commitment to the future to our children and their children for generations to come. And we've already started to see that. In the past couple days, we have seen across the state of Wisconsin that school districts have sent out notices forewarning that layoffs might be on the way in those school districts. The people from one end of the state to the other. In fact, the Senate Majority Leader's wife was one of those who got one of those notices. Now, those notices are going out not because of what we're saying today, but because they're anticipating the reductions in state aid that will be in the next state budget. Now, that's not an illogical assumption, because not only have we talked about it, governors all across the country have talked about it, from one end of the country to the other. Even governors in Democrat governors in states have pointed out that they're going to have to cut aid for schools and local governments. The difference is, where we want to be unique, where we want to lead the way, where we want to be forthright in offering a better alternative to what other states are offering, is that here in Wisconsin, we want to give our schools and our local governments the ability to offset those cuts, those reductions in state aid, and in turn give them the tools to make up that amount in terms of savings they can get in their school districts, in their counties, their towns and villages all across the state. Those are the facts, and they're simple. The $1.44 billion worth of savings will exceed the amount of reductions in aid to local governments in the next state budget. That's really what's at stake here. The fact of the matter is, if people don't want those layoffs to go forward, the best thing to do is have those state senators come forward and give us the ability to have a vote. And then, assuming that vote passes, that's one more tool that those local governments can have to offset those reductions. In the same regard, 2 weeks ago, when I first stood here and announced our budget repair bill, I told you that the $30 million of savings in this year's budget was the equivalent of 1,500 positions in state government, and the $300 million worth of savings in the biennium was the equivalent of 5,000 to 6,000 state workers and an equivalent number of state workers, local government workers as well. Again, the facts are clear. If we want to avoid the layoffs that will eventually come at both the state and the local level, the only way to achieve that, the clearest, easiest way to achieve that, is for those 14 state senators to come back to Wisconsin. Now, you know, I traveled around the state today, but I've been talking to folks. In fact, I actually had an interesting email exchange earlier today with one of my old high school classmates, who said he understood why he was doing this. He's actually married to someone who works in government, and he said, well, it wasn't going to be easy for him. He understood why we were going ahead and trying to do this to balance the budget. But he said, like a lot of people in this state, they've just kind of grown tired of this. They're ready to move on. And I can understand that. I'm ready too. I look back at the first 4 or 5 weeks we've been in office, and I think of the remarkable things we've done in this state. We have fundamentally turned this state around, even in a month and a half time. And the beauty of it is, we've done it in many regards in a bipartisan way. The things we put forward to show that Wisconsin is open for business, to put more people back to work, to get the people of the state working again, are things that time and time again in our special session in the first 4 or 5 weeks in office are things where not only Republicans voted for them, but many of the same Senate Democrats who are out of the state right now joined us in voting for. I think there's a growing sentiment across the state that people want to get back to that. People want to get back to that time where we start to move the state forward, and we can do it together in a path that gets us out of all this tension and passion. The easiest way to do that now that the Assembly has passed that bill is for the members of the state Senate to return home, to do the job they were elected to do, and then we can get on with the rest of the state's business. Because it's going to happen. It's going to happen day in and day out. We're going to continue to see bills come up in the Assembly and the Senate, and I think it's only right that those 14 members of the state Senate do what they were elected to do and come back home and vote. So with that, I'll take a couple questions.
Governor, you said that these layoffs in the districts, you said the savings in the austerity measures will offset cuts in state aid. You guys make mistakes. I think layoff notices for next school year shouldn't be able to keep everybody if what you say is true about the savings you're going to have.
No, in their case, they're anticipating the cuts based on assumptions just like school districts all across the country. They don't see a bill passed, and so until a bill's passed that actually gives them the savings, I think they have to assume that those employees are at risk. I mean, I think your question actually ultimately lifts up the point, the very argument I'm making, which is if we fail to do this, if the 14 members of the state Senate decide for the next 2 years they're not going to show up and they're not going to allow a vote on this measure or anything else like that, what happens is the alternative is the state budget is still going to have reductions in there because we've got a $3.6 billion budget deficit. And there aren't a whole lot of options on the table when the overwhelming majority of the general fund goes to aid to local governments. You can't make up a $3.6 billion budget deficit unless you reduce the amount of state aid that goes to local government. And again, that's not a novel concept. That's happening in almost every state across the country. The difference is what's novel about Wisconsin and where we're going to be a leader when it comes to fiscal reform, just like Tommy Thompson was a leader when it came to welfare reform and education reform back in the 90s, is we're going to actually be different than other states where we give those local governments the tools, but they can't count on them until this measure passes and they actually see the impact.
So are you saying if the bill passes, those teachers will not ultimately be laid off?
In their case, what they're assuming, I believe, and again, it didn't come from us, it came from a Wisconsin Association of School Boards memo, as I understand, is what's driving this. They're anticipating somewhere up to $900 million worth of reductions. We have pointed out time and time again this week that the amount, not just overall for governments, but by category, by schools, by municipalities, by counties, by technical schools, by special districts, in every one of those categories, the amount of savings that we give through this budget repair bill will be greater in savings than the amount we will reduce in each of those categories when it comes to state aids. They're assuming that the aid cuts are happening and they don't get the relief in terms of the layoffs. So by and large, now I can't tell in every district down to every person. I don't think that's realistic to expect that I could count for every single one, but I can tell you in mass, the reason they're talking about these warnings is because they're assuming they're going to lose this amount in aid and they're not going to be able to make it up. Our budget repair bill gives them the tools to be able to make that up. Mary?
Governor, could you propose the debt restructuring as part of a separate bill that probably could have easily passed both houses and avoided these layoffs and just taken care of the other components later?
Well, the layoffs that we've talked about up until now, the 1,500, are directly tied to the $30 million worth of savings we achieve in this budget repair bill by starting the pension and health care contribution effective April 1. If we don't get that, we lose $30 million. That's the equivalent of 1,500, 1,500 positions, which ultimately would have to be laid off. If we don't get the $165 million, that's an even larger question. That's an even larger problem. And again, my hope is we had talked about realistically, and we need to have that done by the end of the weekend. It appears as though we could push it no later than Tuesday. Again, I'm an optimist. My belief is, and why I went around the state today in those Senate districts, is I ultimately believe that when push comes to shove, maybe not all, but I think a good number of those 14 state senators put their districts and their state ahead of their party or any of their political affiliation, and they ultimately know that the alternatives, if they don't come back and vote, the alternatives are too dire, and they don't want to see that happen. And that's why we're pushing this. We believe this is the right thing to do to fix the budget now, and it's the right thing to do to make sure we fix the budget long term. Yep.
Governor, you said earlier in the week that if this bill didn't pass, next week you start issuing layoff notices to state employees. When will that start and what jobs will be targeted?
Yeah, for us, we're in no rush to do that because, as I've talked about before, one of the toughest things I've ever had to do as county executive before I was governor was to consider layoffs. Because it's not just laying off numbers, you're laying off real people who have real families at a time when we obviously have a critical gap in our economy. And so I don't want anybody laid off, whether in the government or in the private sector. My job is to help it make it easier for more people to go to work in this state. And so we're under no rush. This is not something we relish. In the end, I'm hoping that we can come to some reasonable accommodation that gets us to the point where we can have a vote and ultimately make sure that we can avoid massive layoffs. But for us, again, the savings, as I mentioned, the $30 million of savings was based on the assumption that the pension and health care contributions, modest as they are, would start effective April 1. The 1,500 number I've talked about for the past 2 weeks is based on the same assumption as if you don't have those savings, that's the equivalent of 1,500 people being laid off by April 1st. And again, if we don't see the Senate come back, probably by the end of next week sometime, we'll have to start working with our agencies and preparing those.
Take
Sure.
one more question.
Sure.
Governor, are you
Down
going
here.
to clear this building
Down here.
tomorrow night?
I'm going to take it from her. You've asked one almost every single day, and I've answered them. So here.
Can you talk about the steps you or the police might take to limit protests in the building beginning perhaps tonight? And then also, what have your discussions recently been like with the Senate Democrats, both if you've talked to any and Republicans as well, since the bill passed the Assembly last night?
I haven't talked to any members of the Senate since the bill passed. Obviously, I was hoping, if I was lucky, maybe I'd see Bob Wirtz, Dave Hansen, or Jim Holprin somewhere today in their districts, and certainly would have loved to have a talk with them there. And I mean that earnestly. I'd love to have a talk and find out, how we can make the case to come back. But over the weekend, I'm hoping to reach out to talk to lawmakers and see if there's a way we can convince folks to come back and take a vote. Because again, I think people in the state are tired. They're ready to move forward, and I certainly hope the state senators are as well. As far as the police, that's something, there's no efforts tonight. I think there's an interest by the Capitol Police by the end of the weekend to consider start going back to normal business hours in the Capitol. The State Assembly's completed its work. The State Senate wouldn't be in until next week. And that, again, is going to be left up to the Capitol Police to determine that. Thanks very much.